Good morning, Mike. Happy to have you.
Ladies and
Hey,
gentlemen.
guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, hear
Yes,
you
sir.
great, man. Good
Thanks
to
for
be
having
with
me.
you. Mike Bratton of that SEC podcast. We got a request for you to say, "What are you doing, you big Gamecock homers?" I keep talking about wanting cousin Shane to come on too, man, because it's awesome. But Mike, we had SEC media days a couple of weeks ago, and this coaches poll just came out, and from the looks of it, based on this poll, and the coaches poll actually isn't, what it used to be, right? It looks like the SEC as a whole, outside of the top usual suspects, and maybe A&M being a little high, is a little bit disrespected. I mean, you got multiple Big 12 teams, Pac-12 teams, ACC teams, and Big 10 teams ranked ahead of, what normally is about the top 6 or 7 in the conference.
Yeah, hey, breaking news. So this is real live reaction. I did not know that, JC. I was working out. I got to get myself going to get for these interviews. So I'm looking at it right here. And yeah, I mean, A&M 7, I disagree with that. Let's see. I think A&M should be closer to 15, maybe, right around top 10, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Kentucky, 21, that feels about right. Arkansas should be a lot higher. I don't think Ole Miss, I know they had a great season. They don't have any business being ranked. I think Tennessee, you got to rank them. And I've said this before. I'm not just trying to suck up to you and your audience, but I think South Carolina should be ranked. And maybe they don't deserve that. I'm fine with them having to earn that ranking, but I would actually, I mean, you're telling me you're taking Houston over South Carolina on a neutral field? I sure as hell wouldn't.
No, definitely not. Yeah, and that's my point. I mean, I'm like, look, no offense to Dave Aranda and Baylor, but if Baylor, let's say Baylor played Arkansas, I mean, like an old Southwest Conference get together, I don't know that I wouldn't take Baylor in that game. I don't know they beat Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl after Matt Corral got hurt, blah, 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 and Aranda's a good coach, but, I certainly wouldn't take NC State over just about every team in the SEC except Vandy.
Right.
I mean,
I don't know how much stock you put into point spreads, but I'm pretty sure Pitt is an underdog currently at home against Tennessee week 2. So what in the hell are they doing at number 16? I have no idea. In Southern Cal, I guess we're just giving them the benefit of the doubt every year, huh?
Yeah, it's like, Lincoln Riley got all these transfers, and they're going to be really good on offense. Their defense, and then you got to play. They got to get a lot tougher. They're kind of like Texas in that regard. They need to get a lot tougher, and they got to play the Utah Utes, which I think we're all about to see. It'll be a pretty tough team here in week 1 down at the Swamp. So you mentioned South Carolina. You think they should be ranked? I on paper, I could make an argument for it if people kind of look at who they have. What makes you, and I know you've been bullish on Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks here for a while, and you actually were a little bit more bullish on them last year. One of the few people that said, hey, they got a shot to go to a bowl and all that. So what's your take from there where you're at about South Carolina?
Well, it all starts with the fact that they won't have a coach under center starting out right out the gate. I mean, just a massive, massive improvement. I always caution South Carolina fans that are touting Spencer Rattler for the Heisman, and I don't think it's their fault because he's on the Heisman odds. He legitimately is, but I think that's a little ridiculous. But I think you can make the case he's one of the top 5 quarterbacks, or at least he will be one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the SEC. So that's a massive upgrade. I love the weapons that they've surrounded him with. I think they've got, one of the best tight end combos in the country. The transfer receivers from James Madison at Arkansas State, I think they're going to be major upgrades. And that's before we even, I don't want to overlook Josh Vann, who's probably the best of the group. And I like their additions at running back. I think they go 3 deep at running back. So, the problem is the offensive line, which returns everybody, which sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's not. But
yeah,
I'd rather have them back an experienced group than not. And of course, Marcus Satterfield. And I keep saying this to everybody that'll listen. You'll be amazed how good a coach is when they have players that can run their system and they have difference makers on the outside, which I think they'll have. If the offense isn't significantly improved this year, then we'll know it's a Marcus Satterfield issue.
Yeah, that's gonna take care of itself, I think. Looking at the SEC East, I've said this many times. I think you've got to pick Georgia, but I also don't want to. I think sometimes we had a guest on earlier that called a take lazy, and I think sometimes it's a somewhat of a lazy take to look at massive amounts of talented players, right? Leaving a program and then looking at the recruiting rankings and just going, well, they're going to reload like Alabama. There's been one Alabama in our lifetime, right? And I'm not saying Georgia can't be the next Alabama, but you lose that many freaks. And Mike, they were freaks. I mean, look at their numbers from the combine, Trevon Walker. I mean, all the way down. I mean, Nakobe Dean didn't even go in the first round, which I thought was a joke, but that's one of the best linebackers I've ever seen in my career, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to downplay their losses, but I do think when you look at the rest of the East, you still got to go with Georgia. After that, between the next spot and Vandy, Vandy I think would probably be 7th. Wow, shake them up in a box. What's your take on that? Because you kind of look and there's intriguing aspects about every team, and then there's warning signs and red flags and all the things that you when you say that negatively. So your take on that middle part of the Southeastern Conference's Eastern Division?
Yeah, I got no idea, JC, and I think that's good. I think that's good for the SEC. It's going to be one heck of a year, but I went on record. I went a little bold. I got Florida number 2, and a lot of that has to do with the fact they host Kentucky early. I think that'll be one of those games where it's kind of a crossroads. Whoever loses that game is probably going to fall down the standings towards the end of the season. Whoever wins it is going to build that momentum. They do have to go to Tennessee, but hell, I'm a Tennessee grad, so I can tell you I'm never picking Tennessee to beat the Florida Gators. I don't care where that game's played. And Kentucky, again, they have to go to Tennessee, and they host Georgia. I already said they went to Florida. I think they're going to lose all 3 of those games, and that's before you get to an improved South Carolina. They have to play Mississippi State, which whooped them last year. They have to play at Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a complete wild card. I don't know what to make of them, but I'm just seeing the losses kind of rack up for Kentucky. And that's not to say they're a terrible football team by any means, but I just think that Will Levis in particular being a little overhyped. I think he's a good player. I've heard from people in the NFL say, realistically, he's a 3rd-round pick, and that's why he came back to school. I mean, this first overall – that's a joke. And I've had high-level NFL people tell me that. So, again, you're a 3rd-round pick. You're a hell of a quarterback. So I'm not sitting here trashing him. But for anybody that thinks that Will Levis can carry the Kentucky Wildcats to Atlanta when he lost his 3 best offensive linemen, the tackles and the center, those are the 3 positions you don't want to lose. The running back, will he even be eligible for Florida? We don't know. And people are just completely dismissing the loss of Wan'Dale Robinson, he was just dynamic for them. 2nd-round pick. Kentucky doesn't have 2nd-round picks at receivers once, but every 20 years down there. So I don't think there's any way they replace that. And I think their offense is going to struggle by SEC standards this season.
Wow, that's bold because a lot of Wildcat fans, man, the Big Blue Nation's going to get after you. The folks that run the Music City Bowl.
Yeah, beyond where they are now, Mike, right?
the folks that run the Music City Bowl are pissed, man, because they're like, well, we want to invite the Wildcats, I talking to Phil earlier, and Phil, maybe you want to dive into this with Mike a little bit. We talked about the Pirate. We talked about Mike Leach. Phil, what do you got to ask Mike about this Mississippi State thing? Because it was very intriguing when you were talking about it earlier.
Well, I think Ole Miss being a question mark this year. I'm with you on that, Mike, because it's just we don't know what they've got down there. But when you look at it from year over year, Mississippi State is returning a lot of starters. You've got a brilliant mind on offense who last year jumped up and took off a couple of teams they shouldn't have, and I'm looking for them to do it again, if not build off of that, Mike. I feel like it's just they're kind of primed and waiting in the wings right now, just sitting back quietly, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Mississippi
Yeah.
State just loaded with experience, like you said, Phil. Return 100% of the passing yards, 100% of the rushing yards. The only team in the SEC that does that. Return 6 receivers that caught at least 29 passes. A big question mark for Mississippi State, though, is that they lose both offensive tackles. And
Yep.
they didn't have offensive tackles during the COVID year. And it was we all remember the 623 yards passing they had in the opener. But what we forget was just the nightmare inconsistency it was, because obviously they're going to throw the ball 90% of the time down there in Mississippi State. But you got to be able to pass block. So they did add the top junior college offensive tackle in the country. They're hoping that he can plug in. He's a 6'8" mountain of a man named Percy Lewis. So if he can come in there and plug,
that's a hell of a name for an offensive lineman, man.
The offense should be one of the best. I'm right there with you. I think we just overlook Mississippi State for whatever reason. I guess I don't know, because they're supposed to be dead last in the West every year. But
Right.
Zach Arnett, I think, is a heck of a defensive coordinator. I think he does tremendous work with, he doesn't have many elite players to play with, but he gets a lot out of that group. So I'm right there with you. I think if they can beat LSU in Death Valley, which is a tough ask, I think they're going to be 4-0 to start the year.
Wow, Mississippi State, the Pirate, man. I'll never forget that in the pandemic year, opened up the season, and I was like, I think Mississippi State's going to beat LSU, because I don't think Bo Pelini knows how to defend this offense. And lo and behold, I was prophetic. I mean, the people I was hanging out with were like, because we were so ready for football to start that year. It didn't start at the end of September, and they were like, "My goodness, man!" My buddy, he's big Tennessee fan, Mike. He was like, "Goodness gracious, man, you're right." He couldn't believe that the Pirate won. And then they had the video where they had the bandwagon, like an actual bandwagon. And like, if you want to get on the bandwagon,
hey, I love Coach O more than anybody out there. I'm sad to see that he's no longer in the SEC, but he did say they've upgraded from losing Dave Aranda to Bo Pelini that offseason.
He did. Yeah, that was tough. That was like Spurrier before the 2014 season said, Coach Ward tells me my defense this year could be better than last year's. Shoot. And then, oh my God, that was a terrible defense. That was awful. I mean, that was just a disaster. So, but yeah, you got to be careful. Shoot, those assistant coaches, they wasn't really truthful, was he? Anyway. So yeah, Zach Arnett is a star. I agree with you completely there. LSU, so we mentioned LSU because everybody's talking about Texas A&M. Hey, hats off for the best recruiting class in the history of college football on paper, and especially the D-line class they signed. Anybody that knows a lot about D-linemen knows that if you want to step in as a true freshman in this league and play at a high level, that is rare. And I think a lot of people are penciling these 5 stars in, man, like it's the Fab Five from Michigan basketball, and just saying A&M's going to keep on rolling, baby. And I think I said they were a year away last year. I think they're probably still about a year away. I think they'll get better as the season goes on. They don't really have that tough of a schedule, except for obviously the SEC West. But everybody talks about A&M, Bama. Everybody talks about how bad Auburn could potentially be. LSU, though, I don't hear much talk about that. Brian Kelly's in. They got the quarterback from Arizona State, who I thought was a ball player. A lot of portal activity, a lot of folks coming in, going out. I think Brian Kelly's a hell of a coach. Your thoughts about the LSU Tigers in 2022?
Well, credit to you guys, because you've asked me about the 2 teams, Ole Miss and LSU, that I got no idea about, because who in the heck knows with all the transition they've had, no idea who's going to be that starting quarterback. You mentioned Jaden Daniels. I like Garrett Nussmeier. I think he's got the highest ceiling of those guys in that system. Now, does he fit exactly what they want to do? Probably not. It probably is Jaden Daniels. But then Miles Brennan's got, he's a leader of that locker room as it's relayed to me. So very interesting to see how that quarterback duo shakes out. LSU should have an elite defensive line, one of the best in the SEC. They just lost a running back, Trey Bradford, who no longer with the program. But everybody I keep talking to down there is hyping up John Emery, who was a 5-star. He was ineligible last year, but they've been hyping up John Emery for about 3 years now. So if not now, it's got to be now for John Emery. They probably have the best receiver in the SEC, Keyshawn Butte.
Mm-hmm.
They've got nice pieces, but the schedule, it's pretty rough. Right out the gate, Florida State. They should beat Florida State. It's in New Orleans, but, year one, game one, that's a tricky one, I think, for Brian Kelly.
Maybe,
and then I hit on it. Week 3, Mississippi State comes to town. If you don't have your team ready to play, you're going to lose to Mississippi State. And all of a sudden, all these LSU fans that think you're the next Nick Saban, I'm not saying they're going to put them on the hot seat, but they're going to be madder than damn it if they're 1-2 to start the season.
Oh, yeah. You lose that game in New Orleans and you lose in Baton Rouge to Mississippi State, which never happens. They got the Lobos, then they go to Auburn. And, and I mentioned everybody's talking about how bad Auburn's going to be. If you look at the ESPN, now look, this ESPN, FPP, whatever thing they do, I think it's garbage, by the way.
It is.
It's garbage. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking in some cases, but they had Auburn, 10th in the country. They had Mississippi State 10th in the country last year in this thing. And then, but if you also look at the blue chip ratio, 54% of Auburn's roster is made up of 4 or 5-star guys. I think they do have players. Here's my question to you about Auburn. Can they start 5-0? And here's the schedule. Mercer, San Jose State. Watch out for the Spartans, by the way. Penn State, that's a big game. Missouri, LSU. 5 straight at Jordan-Hare to open for the Tigers.
Yeah, I'll answer that in just a second, JC, but you hit on something with the ESPN FPI. My favorite FPI story, 2019 LSU goes on a magical run. I think it's the greatest college team we've ever seen, most balanced team, 15-0, just beat the hell out of Clemson, Ohio State in the playoff. Do you know at the end of the season, ESPN FPI's rankings?
No.
They had Ohio State, which they beat by like 40 points, number 1. Clemson, number 2, which they clashed. They just trashed them in the championship game the day before. 15-0 LSU was number 3. That was their final ranking. So, yeah, to hell with the ESPN FPI. But you can look that up. But
somebody needs to check their data, dude. Like, who's this guy that's doing it? I mean, I like to see this crew of motley. It's probably like that in Men in Black, the little slugs that smoke cigarettes. They're the ones in there doing, ESPN, we love the FPP, the FPP, what the hell ever. That's fine. That's just, hey, man, Clemson finished number 2 and got the hell beat out of them. Oh, great, It is garbage. You're right. But, Auburn, 5-0. I've said that to people, but go ahead.
5-0, no, I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't even – that Penn State game is tricky. That's going to be one where they nationally televised. They're going to be able to build a ton of momentum, no doubt. But I think the game I'm more interested in is that Missouri football game.
Really?
I think Missouri is going to have a lot on the line there. I think Missouri is being slept on a little bit. I don't know if you guys, if you follow SEC StatCap, but I've had him on my show, and he runs the numbers on all these guys. Brady Cook, we didn't see much of him last year, so it is a small sample size. You got to take that into consideration. But according to his metrics of how he grades these quarterbacks, he says Brady Cook, there's only 5 quarterbacks he puts in elite category based on last year's film, and Brady Cook is one of them. So, again, very, very small sample size, only like a game and a half tape. So take that, with a grain of salt. But if he is the guy and if he can produce in that system, I think there's a real chance Missouri goes down there and upsets Brian Harsin, and that's going to start the clock on how quick they can run him out of town.
Yeah,
and that's before the LSU game. So I think it's very, very unlikely that Auburn's 5-0.
I got you. Missouri, of course, week 2, they got a big test crossing the border into the state of Kansas, I think for the first time since they've joined the SEC, to play Kansas State. That's not who they hate. Everybody wonders who Missouri hates. They don't hate Oklahoma. They may dislike Oklahoma, but they don't hate Arkansas. Regardless of how the SEC tries to facilitate that rivalry, they don't hate. I think they don't like South Carolina too much, but because they play for a trophy. But Kansas, the Jayhawks, that's their big rival. But they're going to Kansas State week 2. That Kansas State's very well coached. They got a very good coach. They beat Oklahoma, I think, 2 years ago. They're just still that tricky team, with the exception of the 3 years under Ron Prince. They've had that, and they replaced Bill Snyder with a guy that's a lot like Bill Snyder. So I think that's going to be tough. They play Abilene Christian, and then they go to Auburn. So, yeah, you're right. You go steal a win in Manhattan, Mike, and all of a sudden you're 3-0. And you go to Auburn and win, you're 4-0 with Georgia coming to Como. So that could be the case. Missouri had a very good recruiting class. Luther Bowden, by the way, is going to be special player at wide receiver for the Missouri Tigers. All right, wrapping up with Mike Bratton. Back to the Gamecocks. Spencer Rattler gets talked about. You mentioned some of the supporting cast, but defensively, I think there's room for improvement against the run, but Carolina does have some players coming back. Your thoughts on the Gamecock defense?
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that right out the gate, week 2, they got to play Arkansas at Arkansas. I think they're going to be the best rushing. They were last year, best rushing attack in the SEC. Bring back 4 or 5 on the offensive line and top 3 running backs, and KJ Jefferson, who's probably the best running quarterback in the conference. So it's kind of a nightmare matchup. It's not one of these where I don't think South Carolina's got a shot, particularly playing that game early is going to help, because that Razorback Stadium can get pretty intense in the evening, no doubt. Texas found out the hard way. But, yeah, Clayton White was one of the biggest surprises, I thought, in the SEC last year. I thought he did a tremendous job. We all recognize Will Muschamp as a defensive guru, but, of course, the defense was just god-awful his final year. So I was kind of anticipating more of the same last year under Clayton White, but they were a scrappy bunch, and now I think getting the linebacker depth I think is critical, because they had virtually no linebackers last year after some injuries set in. They've got talent on the defensive line, and hearing great things about the transfer safety they brought in, and we all know they got one of the best corners in the country. So could be a really, really good South Carolina defense that with Spencer Rattler and all the additions on the offensive side of the ball, I think the defense is getting a little overshadowed in Columbia.
Yeah, I think they need to stop the run. And like we said, you open with Georgia State. That was the 8th ranked rushing attack in the country. At Arkansas, that was the 7th. And then the Georgia Bulldogs come to town, and we know they're going to run the ball. And they were 36th, I think, last year running the football. So you're going to find out if this defensive rush defense is going to be better next year quickly. All right, Mike Bratton, that SEC podcast.